Hey, what's up everyone? I hope you're all having a great day. Today I wanted to talk about staying positive in a competitive environment and dealing with frustration. If you're like me and you enjoy playing competitive games, frustration is probably a common emotion that you're all too familiar with. Whether it be because of some mistakes you made, some mistakes your teammates made, or just some casual internet lag, frustration can not only be a very uncomfortable experience, but it can even affect our performance. This is a challenge because we often get frustrated in the first place because of bad performance, and because we get frustrated we perform even worse, which only serves to make us even more frustrated. This cycle can continue until we get so frustrated that it can even ruin the rest of our day outside of the game. Wanting to win is of course the natural goal of all competitive players, but if we could somehow learn to deal with frustration and prevent it from affecting us negatively, it would most likely improve our experience of the game, both practically and subjectively. The value of mental fortitude is often understated, and yet in my opinion it is the most valuable skill to have in a competitive setting. Regardless of how good you are in theory, if you can't perform in a less than ideal scenario, you're probably limiting your own potential and causing yourself to be inconsistent. Controlling our emotions is difficult, and if you think about it for a second, it's not something that you can actually do, at least not literally. If you're happy, and you can't really force yourself to feel otherwise. Emotional regulation is something that happens automatically in our brain, similar to our heartbeat. Sure, we can do things like sprint for 10 seconds to manipulate our heartbeat, and we can even do cardiovascular training to change it in the long term, but you can't control it like how you can wiggle your fingers at will. I think our emotions are similar. You can't move them like your fingers, so when we talk about controlling our emotions in a literal sense, it's often a hopeless effort. Usually when we say we're controlling them, we're actually just ignoring them, which is probably just going to end up in even worse results in the future. Instead, I think it's best to think of emotions more like how we would think about other aspects of health. We need to make circumstantial changes, and over time, if we practice making those changes, we can train ourselves to have better emotional responses to certain situations. Looking at it this way, handling our frustration is a literal skill that we have to develop. It is not something that you can just flip a switch and turn on. Like our aim, we master it using deliberate and intentional practice strategies, and over time, we can see results. I personally struggled a lot with handling my own frustrations in games, especially when I was younger, and I wanted to share some thoughts that I think might be helpful to players who have had similar experiences. Now, I should mention quickly that emotional regulation is connected to mental health, and like physical health can be affected by disorders and therefore need more specific attention beyond just personal circumstantial changes. If you have a heart disorder, for example, being healthy might not be enough and might require more fundamental changes like surgery or perhaps medication. In cases similar to that, I'm not qualified to talk about, so keep in mind that anything I say is really just meant for dealing with the typical kind of frustration or emotions that are induced by a competitive environment, and not with anything more extreme. With that being said, I think frustration can be described as a negative emotion in response to not being able to achieve a successful result at something that we care about. In the case of games, it's usually that we would like to win, and if we don't win, then naturally we get frustrated. And frustration can also come from more specific things. We probably want decent teammates, so when we see that our DPS is 0 and 5, or our support has 2k healing in 10 minutes, it can also cause frustration. But the unfortunate reality is that in competitive games, these sources of frustration are going to happen, so having strong emotional intelligence can go a long way. I think the first thing we should do to limit the amount of frustration we feel is to change our mindset. Our mindset often determines how we might initially react to a situation. If I go to McDonald's with the mindset that it's going to be the best meal of my life, I'm setting myself up to be disappointed. But if I first remember that McDonald's is probably just going to be your average fast food meal, then you might actually have a chance of enjoying it. I find that a lot of frustrations from competitive players come from the fact that they play as if winning is their only goal. There is nothing wrong with wanting to win, since that's the point of the game, but if you go into a game with only that as your goal, you're only going to be able to enjoy half of your time in what is supposed to be a recreational activity. Not only that, but as you get better at the game, you're not really going to be winning more, because you'll be placed into higher skilled games. So if winning is the only reason you're playing, then you're never really going to feel like you've accomplished anything. If winning is the only thing that is enjoyable, then games will actually be less enjoyable over time. You will feel no return on your investments of time and effort, since the only reward you get is harder games, and therefore less wins. And the game will start to feel like just a complicated slot machine. When you play, it's as if you're an addicted gambler betting your own time in the hopes of getting a win. which is of course not something that's entirely in your control in the first place, especially if you're playing at your own skill level. Because of this mindset, some players either quit the game and move on to the next game where the same thing will happen again, or they resort to smurfing full time, where ironically the only account they play on is their alt account. I think the way to fix this mindset is to refocus our motivation on something that is less random and more consistent yet still productive. If there's something to be gained regardless of whether you win or lose, then the game can be enjoyable every time instead of just half of the time. I think the real spirit of competitive games shouldn't be just to win. Winning and losing are just aspects of the game, but our focus as players should be to simply learn and improve. If you realize that learning and improvement is possible regardless of the outcome of each game, then you'll always have something to gain, and in some ways you're always going to be a winner. No matter how small, if you learn something today that you didn't know yesterday, you've made real progress, and so even if you lost every game you played, there is no reason to be disappointed because every game was a learning opportunity. We shouldn't try to determine our own happiness by looking at the number that appears on our screen, and this applies to many things that you can probably think of. If success is determined by the number below the shiny medal on our career profiles, then we're going to be caught in an endless cycle of satisfaction and frustration. Instead, recognize that numbers are just numbers, and sometimes they go up and sometimes they go down. But if your focus is on personal improvement and you invest efforts into that goal, the long-term trend will always be upward, even if certain days feel like failures. We don't always recognize progress as it's happening. Maybe today you lost some games and you genuinely don't know what you could have done better. But how many times in life do we do something seemingly with no purpose just to realize its value somewhere in the future when we look back? Hindsight is often more clear than foresight. If you try and recall some of your first games of Overwatch, you can probably remember some things that you used to do that you would now consider very silly. At that time, you probably didn't realize that what you were doing was silly, but each and every one of those games contributed to you becoming the better player that you are now. Sometimes we might get stuck in our ranked journey, or we might even get deranked, but progress is happening even if it's not something that we can see. Aside from the outcome of a game, another source of frustration could be simply the circumstances of the game itself. Inevitably, in any game, but especially team-based games, not every match is going to be of equal quality. Oftentimes, games can be one-sided, and sometimes you're going to be on the losing end. Unfortunately, some aspects of the game are simply out of our control, and we are often victims of poor circumstances. Sometimes we get levers and throwers, or just bad teams in general. If we can accept and recognize that these things are ultimately out of our control, we can realize that being frustrated at these kinds of things is kind of pointless. A simple flowchart that I like to think about relates problems with whether or not you should worry about it. If you don't have a problem, then of course you don't need to worry. If you have a problem that you can solve, then you also don't need to worry because you can solve it. If you have a problem that you can't solve, then you especially don't need to worry because there's no point anyway. I think we can also relate this to frustration in games. The problem we're trying to solve is winning the game. If you win the game, then there's no need to be frustrated. If you lose the game and there was something you could have done to carry, then now you learn something that you can use to carry your next games. If you lose the game and there wasn't anything you could have done, then there's nothing to be frustrated about. The most you can do is the best you can do. So if you tried your best already, you've already done your job. There's no point in trying to do better than your best in the context of a single game because that's logically impossible. Improvement is something that happens gradually over many games, so don't be disappointed in yourself too much if you weren't able to solve the problem even after trying your best. Another kind of circumstantial problem arises from just people in general, in particular unreasonable people. I'm sure we've all had to deal with teammates who just argue, flame, and rage all game in the text or voice chat. This can of course also be very frustrating to deal with, but I think we can use the same logic that allows us to deal with bad teams. There's no point in trying to reason with unreasonable people. That's why they're called unreasonable in the first place. People who have worked in customer service or retail may know this all too well. If you try to have an intelligent conversation with someone who's insistent on being stupid, they're just going to bring you down to their level. The best protocol in general is to just ignore them if you can, or just tell them what they want to hear. Sometimes we can feel like we can't let people get away with being terrible, and so we want to speak up, but just keep in mind that not every terrible person in your life needs to be addressed. You probably already have encountered and probably will continue to encounter many such people, and if it's someone you know personally that's exhibiting what you would consider poor behavior, maybe speaking up is not a bad idea. Because in that case, they have an effect on your life and you have an effect on theirs, and so there's at least a practical reason to respond. But when it comes to dealing with strangers on the internet, especially in the context of a game, it's just a waste of your own time and energy. If the person is saying random things in the chat, nothing you say will change anything about them. Now, I know the reason most people respond is of course not to help the person, but because we have the instinctual need to not let people be rude to us. But by responding, remember that you're actually giving the rude person exactly what they want. Remember that unreasonable people aren't normal, and they're not looking for a conversation, they just want someone to yell at, for reasons that they might not even be aware of. The best thing you can do for the sake of practicality and just your own sanity is to just ignore them, and let them continue being stupid. They're not paying you to play, and so you don't owe them anything, especially not your time and energy. Don't let random people ruin your already limited valuable free time. Now, with that being said, although I recommend just letting things go, sometimes you just have to say something because someone is just being that ridiculous, and this can be the case in any part of your life. So 99% of the time, just ignoring the ridiculousness is the way to go. But in the 1% of situations, if you must respond, remember to never mirror someone's energy. How many times have you seen two players just typing back and forth about how much they think the other person sucks at the game? Instead, you want to lean into what they're trying to say with just a hint of sarcasm. So if they say you're bad, you can just say something like, "You're playing really well, good job." The key to dealing with ridiculous people is not to be ridiculous yourself, and it's not to let them know that you think they're stupid. All you have to do is show them how ridiculous they're being by pretending to take what they say seriously. Again, not recommended, but if you must respond to someone, I would do it that way. The last point I want to make about dealing with frustration is just to remember that the time you spend playing games, whether they're competitive or not, is supposed to be time that you enjoy. Games are recreational activities, and the most important thing is that you're supposed to have fun. So if you ever find yourself not having fun, maybe something in the process has gone wrong. We don't live very long, and a third of the time is already spent sleeping, and about half the time is spent working and tending to life's responsibilities. So don't let things ruin the already little yet valuable free time you have. Remember the age-old advice that it's just a game. It's not that important and it's not that serious. You're not going to die if you lose, and you don't get paid if you win. So when you feel the frustration coming, simply take a breath, take a figurative step back, and just remember why you started playing the game in the first place. I should emphasize that it's not about ignoring our emotions or pretending that they don't exist. That would be an example of toxic positivity. Rather, learning to convert your reaction to your emotions from something destructive to something constructive is a great skill to learn. We can't control our emotions directly, but by training ourselves to react a certain way, you might actually find that your natural emotional response to something starts to change. Seeing your teammates dive into the enemy backline 1v5 might seem very frustrating, but if you can remember that games are supposed to be fun, that scenario might start feeling quite hilarious and even comedic. While we still might be disappointed when our teammates don't perform well, at least it's funny. And that's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. Let me know about your own ways of dealing with frustration. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.